Good morning. You can be keeping your Bibles open to the book of Nehemiah. We're going to spend most of our time there this morning. We'll move about a bit, but most of our time will be spent there in the book of Nehemiah. So good to see you this morning. It is a joy to be here worshiping with you. John made mention here at the table that we had been gone for a week or so out in California. And it was a beneficial trip in a lot of ways. There's been questions about that, about how that trip went and some things that took place. I'm going to give you a little bit of that this morning. But I'll add, if you've got any other questions about the trip itself and what was going on out there and how things are going, I'd be happy to answer those questions. John would. Kim and Ashley both were out there. They'd be happy to talk with you about those things as well. We were out there for a week. And in a lot of ways, there was stuff going on from the morning until we got back pretty late, after dark each night. And that was interesting, certainly as we were trying to adjust to the time. And our time out there in a lot of ways is split into really two different categories. It is either us studying in some capacity, or it's us being with them and encouraging them in some capacity. And so, for instance, they have studies going on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And while John are out there, we participate in those studies with them. We had an additional study on Thursday, just John and I and Calvin and Josh, that we studied together for several hours. And then we actually recorded a podcast with them as well. And so that was enjoyable, and we enjoyed spending that study time with them. They had additional kind of a weekend meeting, is what we would call it, on Friday night, but not just for an hour, for 2 hours on Friday night, for 2 more hours on Saturday night that we were together, and then worshiped with them on Sunday. Kim and Ashley taught the little kids class there at the building they meet at on Sunday, and they also had a ladies class deeper into Sunday afternoon. So there was a lot of that happening. But there was also a lot of just time being with them, spending time with Josh and Kirby and with Calvin. And they continue to need our encouragement. And they continue most certainly to need our prayers. And they need our prayers in several different ways. They need our prayers specifically for Josh and for Kirby and for Calvin and the work that they're doing out there. The Christians, though few that are out there, they need our prayers. There were a couple, Summer and Francis. We spent more time with them this time than we had before. The other Christians, they need your prayers. And the work itself needs your prayers. And so we'll continue to pray for them as they continue to pray for us and our work here. And so for our time studying God's Word together this morning, I want to direct your attention in a lot of ways to where we were last weekend while we were there. This is just a little advertisement that they put together, kind of advertising their weekend meeting. And 2 of us spoke on Friday, 2 of us spoke on Saturday, and then we worshiped together on Sunday. And they had a few visitors that came, and that was good to see. And to be able to spend time with them as well. But the entire weekend was kind of built around a series of lessons that John put together from the books of Nehemiah and Ezra about being built together. And we covered lots of different things. Remember, 2 full lessons on Friday, 2 full lessons on Saturday, another lesson on Sunday. And so this morning, I'm going to take those 5 lessons and give you all of them. Now, listen, we don't come back tonight, so I feel like I've got 2 or 3 hours. I made mention already, we were together a couple hours Friday and Saturday, and, that seemed okay, and so maybe we give that a try this morning. Nobody believes that, so that's good. We won't do that. But I'm going to give you some things that we talked about. As we were kind of going through these lessons, it was apparent to me that these were useful lessons to that small group out there in San Francisco, talking about these kinds of things. But at the same time, as we were studying together, I was thinking of our group here. A lot of ways similar, but different. Certainly size is the easiest way to see the difference. But as you study through these books, and we talked about the things that we talked about last weekend, it became apparent that those lessons are needed here as well, as we strive to build together. And that's what the book of Nehemiah is in a lot of ways. We had read for us from Nehemiah chapter 1. It kind of sets the story of what the book of Nehemiah is. If you're trying to keep the books of Ezra and Nehemiah separate in your mind, both are about building. Ezra is about rebuilding the temple. Nehemiah is about rebuilding the walls around the city of Jerusalem. Both of them monumental tasks to take. Both of them, the people were struggling to get going and to get started. And so Ezra was there to kind of motivate the people to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah is there to motivate the people to rebuild the walls. But there is a practicality about it, and there is great analogy in a lot of ways about the building that was taking place in these two books, especially the book of Nehemiah, and the building that takes place for us today. Now, we're not building walls around cities like they were in Nehemiah, but we are building. And that is an analogy of, in a lot of ways, just the life that I'm living, the life that I'm putting together. Jesus will make reference to it specifically in Matthew chapter 7 in the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to read that text in just a moment. But he uses that analogy of building something. And that is the life that we are living. And so in a lot of ways, each of us are building. We're building things. We're building our life. We're building the life that we are living and the decisions that we make. And so I want us to be kind of thinking about that analogy. And we're going to be using some other Bible analogies to help us as well. But we're going to use the book of Nehemiah to kind of help us with some principles that will kind of put us in the right frame of mind, I think, when it comes to building. And so we're going to start with a principle found in Nehemiah chapter 3. In Nehemiah chapter 3, it's one of those difficult chapters to look at. Because when you look at it, immediately you're like, that seems like genealogy, and I don't do genealogy because I can't pronounce any of those names. And you kind of skim it a little bit, and you work your way through it, and you're like, okay, I got that, and I'm ready to move on to Nehemiah chapter 4. And I think that's what we do a lot when it comes to genealogy, when you've got the he begat him, and he begat him, and he begat him, and you kind of work your way through that. And that's not exactly what we have here in Nehemiah chapter 3. It's more so of this guy's building, this family is building, this family is building. But yet still it is a way in which you can move very quickly through. And if you do so, you're going to miss some pretty important principles. I think one of the foundational principles when it comes to the analogy of us building when it comes to our lives, certainly one that Jesus will use in Matthew chapter 7. And that principle is given to us in chapter 3. Towards the end of that chapter, look beginning with me in verses 28. And we're just going to read down through verse 30. So it says, beyond the horse gate, this is Nehemiah 3, verse 28, the priests made repairs, each in front of his own house. After them, Zadok, the son of Immer, made repairs in front of his own house. After him, Shemaiah, the son of Shechaniah, the keeper of the east gate, made repairs. After him, Hananiah, the son of Shelmiah, and Hanun, the sixth son of Zalph, repaired another section. After him, Meshulam, the son of Berechiah, made repairs in front of his dwelling. And so you have these kind of three verses given to us, one right after the other. And there are some names that I pretended to know how to pronounce them. And I did so with confidence. So everybody out there were thinking, man, he must really know how those names are pronounced. I don't. I just say them with confidence. Ralph Walker taught me that long, long ago. He says, if you say a name with confidence, you can convince people in the audience who know how to pronounce it that they are pronouncing it wrong. You only have to do so with confidence. And so that's what I do. I just say it with confidence. And you're like, man, he really must know how this is. Well, maybe, but maybe not. But the point is, and hopefully you found, is that he's making mention that as this monumental task of building the walls around the city is set to begin, it's difficult to look at the task as its whole and to think, how is it even possible? Mile after mile after mile of ruined and burnt up wall. How is it that we're going to finish something like this? And so one principle that is set in place for us in Nehemiah chapter 3 is Nehemiah getting the people to understand, you be responsible for you. You have a responsibility to yourself. Now, we'll get to the whole wall here in just a moment when we get into Nehemiah chapter 4. What this first principle is, listen, you worry about you. You have a responsibility for your section. And so the picture is kind of given that when you walk out the front of your house, the wall that is right in front of you, you take care of that section. You be responsible for that. And the other guys that I can or maybe can pronounce, they'll take care of that. But the point that's being made is you take care of your section because you have a responsibility there. So I've made mention of it a couple of times. Look over to Matthew chapter 7. In Matthew chapter 7, it's interesting to me because this is a text that a lot of us are familiar with. Certainly the children are familiar with it because it's very popular and a song that everybody loves to sing. But in Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verses 24 through 27, I want us to first take note that when we talk about the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and Jesus does profound and wise teaching when it comes to our relationship with Him, our responsibility as members or citizens in His kingdom, and He talks about what that looks like and what that's all about, and there is profound teaching found there. And this little story is given at the end. It's the close. It's the last thing that He has to say. It's the last thing that He wants them to be thinking about. He's giving them so much. And He says, this is what really makes a difference. And so He uses an analogy, a parable of us and the life that we live as building, specifically a house. Specifically where that house is to be built. Look at what He says. Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 24. Whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. And so one of the points that Jesus is making is He says, in this lesson that I have laid out all of these things to think about, you individually, you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision. Are you going to listen to what I have to say as Jesus is speaking, or are you not going to do that? You're not to make that decision as a whole. You have to make that decision. And you make that decision in the life that you live. The house that you're building. Are you building that house? Are you living that life on the rock of Jesus' words? Where when the difficulties of life come, which inevitably they will, you stand in what you have built? Or are you building, living your life, doing so on the sand, not built upon the words of Christ, built upon your own words or built upon the words of others, where the difficulties of life inevitably come and beat on what you have built, and it will fall, and great will be its fall. You see, Jesus is saying you have to choose. That's the closing of His sermon that He gives there on the mountain. You have to make a choice. You have to be personally responsible for your choices. And so when we go back to Nehemiah chapter 3, we have to understand that. Even though we are many in number, ultimately, I will have to answer for what I have built. I have to answer for that. And that has to be an understood principle. I cannot stand on what Traders Point has built. I cannot stand on what my parents have built or what the elders have built or what anyone else has built. I have to answer for what I have built. And Nehemiah is trying to get these people to take some personal responsibility. And so for us, we have to grab hold of that. So when we go back to Nehemiah now, and we start to think about I'm taking personal responsibility. We read a passage like this in Matthew chapter 7 where Jesus will make mention of the winds and the waves and the floods and the rain, the difficulties of life. There is a reality then that comes to bear that whoever is looking to accomplish anything in life, you can apply this in every capacity of life, schooling, business, whatever, even secular thing that you want to apply. Anyone looking to accomplish anything is always followed by ridicule and difficulty, especially spiritually. If you build your life upon the rock that is Christ, difficulty is going to come. Difficulty is going to come, and we've seen that. Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3 tells us, in speaking about Jesus himself and the great prophecy about what he was going to have to endure, that great text tells us that he was someone who was despised and rejected by men. That was Jesus. Despised and rejected by men. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 22, Jesus himself will make the point. All will be hated for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. You're like, man, what kind of promise is that? What kind of promise is that? All will be hated for my name's sake. Difficulty is going to come. And so as I'm thinking about, I'm building my house, I'm building my wall, I'm taking responsibility for that. I know that difficulty is going to come. And so when we go back to the book of Nehemiah, we shouldn't then be surprised as we get to the next chapter that then is exactly what's happening. That's exactly what's taking place. Is as they continue to work on their section of the wall, incredible difficulty mounts. And there's difficulty in various different ways. There's outside difficulty. There are threats. There are enemies abounding. There is discouragement that takes place. All kinds of difficulty. But what's interesting in Nehemiah chapter 4 is there a text there that gives us a picture that there are some that are working while others are standing guard. And there's a really interesting principle that then is developed. Turn over a page in Nehemiah chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. Listen to the change that has taken place. It says, therefore I position men, this is Nehemiah, behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings. I set the people according to their families with their swords, their spears, their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, your houses. And it happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had brought their plot to nothing, and that all us returned to the wall, everyone to his work. And so it was from that time on that half of my servants worked at construction, while the other half held the spears, the shields, the bows, and wore armor, and the leaders were behind all the house of Judah. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked at construction and with the other held a weapon. Every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built, and the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. And then I said to the nobles, the rulers, the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated far from one another on the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we labored in the work. Half of the men held the spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. At the same time, I also said to the people, let each man and his servant stay at night in Jerusalem, that they may be our guard by night and a working party by day. And so neither I, my brethren, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me took off our clothes, except that everyone took them off then for washing. Now, I want you to picture in your mind what is happening in Nehemiah chapter 4. You remember Nehemiah chapter 3, you have a responsibility of the wall, the section of wall right in front of your house. You have personal responsibility there. But now, things are shifted a little bit to the thinking now broader than that. Not only do you have some responsibility to your section, my section of the wall, but there now is also responsibility that we must be considering our section, we see that biblically. You think about the pages of the New Testament, where it is clear, as we've already read in Matthew chapter 7, that each and every one of us have to take personal responsibility for the decisions that we make. The New Testament text reminds each and every one of us that we will stand, each one of us, before the judge to give an account of the way that we have lived and built. Not together, individually. Every knee will bow before the judge. But yet at the same time, there are other analogies given, specifically in regards to the Lord's church. The Apostle Paul in the book of Romans chapter 12, and the book of 1 Corinthians, and 1 Corinthians chapter 12 uses a perfect analogy of us thinking about our relationship as a body. That we are individual members, but yet we are connected to one another. And not just that, we need one another. I know for a fact. Keith spent time talking about that point when he preached last week. The idea that, yes, we are members individually, but we are all a part of the body. And the point that he then makes is, we need everyone. And it's an analogy that we understand. There isn't a one of us that would sit here and say, you know what? I could take or leave my right hand. I mean, I could take or leave it. You know, I mean, I got another hand and I've got other things that I could use. I could take or leave. None of us would say that. All of us would say, no, I need that. None of us would even say, I could take or leave my pinky finger. No, if we were asked, we're like, no, I need that. I need that. Well, we understand that. We understand that analogy. We need one another. And that is ultimately what's happening. And so when we think about Nehemiah chapter 4, specifically in this text, there are two things that stand out. And the first is when difficulties arise. And that's what's happening here in Nehemiah chapter 4. You're building on the wall and troubles come. And you're scared. You're scared. You're anxious because of the difficulties. I'm building and now there's problems. How do I deal with that? Well, Nehemiah chapter 4 tells us two ways that we deal with that. We've got to look for help. And the first place that we are to look for help is specifically God. You look to God for help. I love chapter 14. I love the phrasing of it in every way. Look at it again. He says, I looked and I arose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. But why? Why not? Why? They're scary. They're scary. Why are we not to be afraid of them? I love this. Remember the Lord. Remember him. Great and awesome. And fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. Don't be afraid of them. Why? You look to God because God is there. He is great. He is awesome. He is so much more than any difficulty that will come. Verse 20 of that same text. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. Our God will fight for us. How do we view our problems? Listen, problems in life are real. They are a reality. And I'm not going to stand up here and diminish any difficulty that you may be facing and to try to paint the picture that the difficulty that you have in your life is just something made up in your mind. Trouble is real. Difficulty is real. Obstacles are real. All of that is real things. And a lot of times it is scary, and a lot of times it seems impossible. I'm not diminishing any of that. But it's how do we view it? Well, there's two different ways you can view it. One way, you can try to see God through your problems, but you're not getting rid of them. I'm reminded of the story in Numbers chapter 13. We won't turn over there and read it this morning, but you can make a note of it. In Numbers chapter 13, specifically verses 26 through 33, as 12 spies are sent out to view the land that God has promised to them. And those 12 men come back. And you remember how they began their conversation? Like, God was right. He's right. The land that he promised, that he said flows with milk and honey in abundance. It is exactly that way. And they brought back the fruit that showcased that. They said God was right on the money. It is a beautiful land, and it is a voluptuous land. It is full of everything that we could ever want. He was right. But if you're familiar with that text, you know 10 of the spies were like, but man, there's big cities there. And there are big people there. And they are fortified, and they are soldiers, and we aren't. And we cannot do it. They were overwhelmed by their problems. God was in there, but he wasn't bigger than their problems. You contrast that with 1 Samuel chapter 17, where you have David standing in front of a giant of a man, capable of defeating all others. But yet David is like, God's not going to have any trouble with this guy. Both of them, big problems. Both of them, big obstacles. Real obstacles. But how do they view them? One understands God and his place. God is there. And so Nehemiah is reminding them, God is here. So when troubles arise, you've got to look to him for help. And for us, and by way of application, it's the same. When our troubles come to try to interrupt our building, we've got to look to God for help. Secondly, there's something else in Nehemiah chapter 4 that I love, and it is also the important point of looking to others for help. Looking to others for help. Did you notice throughout that reading all the times where the point was made, listen, some will build and others will stand guard. Even the ones who live outside the city will come in and help. Others will be there to help with the difficulty. In verse 21 and 22, again, we labored in the work. Half of the men held the spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. And at the same time, I said to the people, let each man and his servant stay at night in Jerusalem, that they may be our guard by day and a working party by night. That he reminds them when there is difficulty, there are others to look to for help. And it's what God has given us. He has given us each other to help. Now, what does that look like? Well, it looks like a couple of different things. When there are challenging times, we've got to be willing to rally around one another. When someone is facing a difficult time, we've got to be able to see it, we've got to be able to sense it, and we've got to be able to rally around them and help them build. But there's a reality to that. And there's a selfishness that we often will have to fight. Because when I go to someone else to help them build, I'm often leaving and sacrificing something behind. Are we willing to do that? But what a beautiful thing that it is. It's a simple thing. Everybody knows I love using Tim. I'll do it again. I've been coming down. He's like big eyeing me right here. I'm building my wall right here. Tim is building his wall right over there. We're next to one another. I'm building here. Tim's building there. Tim faces difficulty. And I see it. I see his struggle. Maybe his struggle is something in this world physically that is demanding upon him. Maybe his struggle is spiritually. But I see he's struggling with his build. Am I willing and loving enough to step away from what I have going on and to come over and help Tim build here? You see, that's what we see in Nehemiah chapter 4. That's what we see in Romans chapter 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, that we are all together. We lift one another up. Maybe that's some physical thing that he is struggling up against. Maybe it's a spiritual thing that he is struggling up against. And there are passages, numerous passages, that speak to that. Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, we love verse 2 especially about bearing one another's burdens. We see that. But that's a general principle in a lot of ways. But in context, especially when you put verse 1 with it, there is spiritual burdens that are needing to be lifted and bore, if you will. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to step away for each other? Difficulty is real. Difficulty is real. And we, as a collective group of God's people, family together, am I willing to look to God for help? Am I willing to look to others for help? Maybe the flip side of my analogy with Tim, sometimes the most difficult thing, and boy, we need both of them, is for Tim to step out and to say to me, you know what, I need help here building for a little while. Powerful principles. Powerful principles. Needed for a small group in San Francisco, building out there, but also needed for a larger group here in Indianapolis, building in a different place, in different ways, but powerful principles for us as we think about our responsibility to God, but also our responsibility we have to each other. So much more in the book of Nehemiah, so much more there. I wish we had the time to dive into all of it. I would encourage you to take a look at that book, to look for those principles. I don't think you'll have to look very hard. It's an easy book to read, and it'll be good for you to do so. Well, Matt is going to lead us in a song of invitation. It gives us an opportunity to be thinking about our relationship with God. We talked about already the importance of understanding that we have an individual responsibility to make sure our relationship with God is where it needs to be. We've made the point that we're going to stand before God, the judge, one day. We're going to stand before him, bowed before him. And it'll either be eternity in heaven with him or eternity in hell forever without him. Those are the only two options. And I know each one of you here this morning wants to spend eternity in heaven. So as we sing this song, let's make sure our life is matching up with that desire. And maybe we can help. If we can, you let us know as we stand and sing.